First of all, I welcome this debate. It's taking place in the run-up to the budget, which will presumably represent the next instalment in government measures to alleviate the impact of COVID-19. Now, COVID-19 doesn't discriminate as between individuals, but it does have a profoundly different effect on different sectors of the economy. I mean, look at our own economy. The biopharma industry, the tech industry are booming, while the hospitality sector and the tourism sector have been hammered. Now, the level of wages in the businesses or industries that have been relatively unaffected by the COVID tends to be much higher than those in the sectors which are most affected. So I'm just wondering, whether the government's approach of one size fits all is the proper approach here. A lot of money has been spent, but I can't sort of get away from the notion that sometimes if you spend just a little bit more, or alternatively if you spend the same money in a different way or a combination of both, you'll get a much better result. So the question arises as to whether the sectors which are most affected should get most help. The Minister will of course say that different measures are in place for the different sectors, but there's no doubt about it that on the big issues, on the big measures, there is uniformity. I cite, for example, the main initiative, in my view, which has been taken by government, the TWSS. In the affected sectors, one of the main demands of me anyway, and I'm sure it probably applies to everybody else, is that the TWSS should not have been suspended in its original form. It should not have been suspended on the 17th of September, but it should be continued on to April for those sectors, because there is a mighty difference between the TWSS and the EWSS. The former is much more valuable than the latter, and in many cases, to my personal knowledge, the difference between both the TWSS and the EWSS will mean the difference between life and death for particular businesses as to whether they can recover or whether they can re-establish themselves or not. So, the government, or the economists have expressed some surprise at the fact that income tax returns have remained particularly stable. There was an expectation, I think, that income tax returns would drop by about 2 billion as a result of the COVID. They haven't. And the reason is obvious. We have a very steeply progressive income tax system where above average wage earners pay the vast majority of income tax. And that illustrates quite dramatically, in my view, and very clearly, that the people who are most affected by this pandemic are people on low wages, young people, part-time workers, people in the gig economy. In other words, the less well-off. They are the people most affected by this pandemic, and they are the people we must, from here on in, focus on helping. Otherwise, we will have what the economists like to refer to as a K-shaped recovery between different household incomes. And we will promote and deepen inequality in this society, in a society which is already very unequal, in my opinion, if we leave those people behind. And, I dread to think of a huge pool of young people, semi-skilled workers, part-time workers, etc., being, distanced from, being separated from the economic activity in their own country, and being left in a situation where they have no immigration safety valve for the first time since the Second World War. That will have a scarring effect on society. It will have an effect on politics, it will have an effect on social cohesion, and not an effect for the good either. Many of these more vulnerable sectors, for example the pubs, they have been closed. Wet pubs have been closed for 6 months. They have enormous fixed costs. They're very unhappy with the measures put in place by the government to assist them. It won't assist many of them to reopen, with consequent effect, particularly in local communities, in rural areas. Somebody mentioned the travel agency business. I mean, the travel agency business are in a unique situation. They've had no income since last March, and they have to give back a lot of the gross income they took in last year as holidays are being cancelled. You have sectors like the live entertainment sector, for example, 35,000 people, 3.5 billion to the economy. Taxi, people have mentioned the taxi industry, which has been absolutely devastated. And I just wonder, if you took those particularly vulnerable sectors of the economy, added up how many workers there are directly involved, and calculate the cost of continuing the TWSS until next April for those particular sectors, if that can be done legally and constitutionally, how much extra would that cost? I know that the extension of the EWSS itself is costing about 2.3 billion. I don't imagine that would add greatly to the cost, because we're talking about particular sectors. But what I would say to the government in conclusion is this: don't be focusing on the deficit. I mean, I know we have to worry about the deficit. So does every other country in the world, because all this thing throughout the world is financed largely by debt anyway. Focus on the primary task of getting our economy rebooted, while at the same time keeping society together.